The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory as Forrest Tucker rode into the small town of Redemption Creek with nothing but a Winchester rifle, a worn Bible, and a heart as hollow as an empty grave. It had been exactly 6 months since he had buried his wife, Beatrice, and with her, every ounce of faith he'd ever possessed. The year was 1876, and the country was celebrating its centennial, but Forrest had nothing to celebrate. He guided his chestnut mare down the dusty main street, past the saloon where raucous laughter spilled into the evening air, past the general store with its windows illuminated by oil lamps, until he reached the small church at the edge of town. He hadn't stepped foot in a church since the day of Beatrice's funeral, but tonight, something drew him here. He dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud that matched the dull ache in his chest. The church stood silent, its weathered doors closed against the coming night. Forrest tied his horse to the hitching post and trudged around to the small cemetery behind the building. Tombstones jutted from the earth like broken teeth, each marking a life that had once meant something to someone. Forrest dropped to his knees before an empty patch of ground. There was no marker here, no indication that this spot meant anything at all. But he knew. This was where he'd left a piece of his heart 6 months ago, in the cemetery of a town hundreds of miles away. Beatrice's grave was far from here, but he carried the weight of it wherever he went. "I don't know why I'm here," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "I don't believe you're listening anymore. Maybe you never were." The sound of footsteps behind him made Forrest reach instinctively for his sidearm, but he paused when a soft voice spoke. "I've found that he listens most carefully when we think he's gone deaf." Forrest turned to see a woman standing a few paces away, silhouetted against the dying light. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, but even in the dim light, he could see the kindness in her eyes. "Didn't mean to disturb your grieving," she said. "I was just bringing fresh flowers to my father's grave." "I'm not grieving," Forrest said automatically, rising to his feet and dusting off his knees. "Just talking to myself, I suppose." The woman stepped closer, and Forrest could see her more clearly now. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her mid-20s, with auburn hair and eyes that seemed to hold their own light. "I'm Brielle Winters," she said, extending her hand. "I'm the schoolteacher here in Redemption Creek." Forrest hesitated before taking her hand. "Forrest Tucker, just passing through. That's what they all say," Brielle said with a gentle smile. "But Redemption Creek has a way of keeping folks longer than they intend to stay." Forrest released her hand and stepped back. "Not me. I'll be moving on come morning." Brielle nodded, but her smile didn't falter. "Well, Mr. Tucker, if you're here tonight, perhaps you'd like to join me in prayer? Sometimes it helps to have someone else's voice when your own feels too heavy to lift." "I don't pray anymore, Miss Winters," Forrest said, his voice hardening. "Lost my taste for it when it did nothing to save my wife." Instead of the pity he expected to see in her eyes, Forrest saw understanding. "Then let me pray beside you," she said simply. The words caught him off guard. He hadn't expected this stranger to offer such a thing, nor did he expect the sudden lump in his throat at her kindness. "I don't see what good it would do either of us," he managed to say. "Prayer isn't always about getting what we want," Brielle said, moving to place her small bouquet of wildflowers on a nearby grave. "Sometimes it's about finding peace and not getting it." Forrest watched as she knelt by the gravestone, her fingers tracing the engraved name, William Winters. Her father, he presumed. He should leave, he knew, climb back on his horse and find a room at the saloon for the night. Drink until he couldn't remember the sound of Beatrice's laughter or the feel of her hand in his. Instead, he found himself kneeling beside Brielle Winters as she bowed her head and began to pray. "Lord, I bring before you this man who's carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. I don't know his story, but you do. I ask that you would lighten his load, not by taking away his memories, but by helping him carry them with grace." Her words washed over Forrest like cool water on parched earth. He didn't believe them, not really, but there was something about the sincerity in her voice that made him want to. When she finished, Brielle remained quiet for a moment, her eyes closed, her face serene in the fading light. Then she looked at him, and Forrest felt as if she could see straight through to all the broken pieces inside him. "Thank you," he said gruffly, not knowing what else to say. "You're welcome, Mr. Tucker," she replied, rising to her feet. "If you're still in town tomorrow, the school is just down the road. I brew a decent pot of coffee in the mornings." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Forrest to wonder why, for the first time in 6 months, he was considering staying somewhere for more than a night. Morning came with the harsh clarity of the western sun, burning away the mist that had settled over Redemption Creek during the night. Forrest woke in his rented room above the saloon, his head pounding from too much whiskey and too little sleep. Dreams of Beatrice had haunted him, as they always did, but this time there had been something else, a pair of understanding eyes and a voice offering to pray when he could not. He told himself he would leave today, as planned. But after washing and dressing, he found himself walking not toward the livery stable to collect his horse, but toward the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. The building was simple but well kept, with a bell tower and freshly painted whiteboards. Through the open windows, Forrest could hear the sound of children reciting their lessons. He hesitated, feeling suddenly foolish. What was he doing here? Before he could turn away, the door opened, and Brielle Winters stepped out, her face brightening when she saw him. "Mr. Tucker," she said, "I was just about to ring the bell for recess. Would you care for that coffee I mentioned?" Forrest nodded, not trusting his voice. He followed her inside as she called to the children to take their break outside. They rushed past him in a flurry of excitement, giving him curious looks as they went. The schoolroom was neat and orderly, with rows of desks facing a larger desk at the front. A blackboard covered one wall, equations and vocabulary words written in a careful hand. Brielle moved to a small stove in the corner where a coffee pot sat warming. "How do you take it?" she asked, pouring the dark liquid into a cup. "Black," Forrest replied, accepting the cup with a nod of thanks. "Been drinking it that way since the war." "You fought in the war between the states?" Brielle asked, pouring herself a cup as well and adding a splash of cream. "Yes, madam." Union side. "Seems like another lifetime now." Brielle gestured to a chair beside her desk, and Forrest sat, cradling the coffee cup in his hands. The warmth seeped into his fingers, a small comfort. "How long have you been teaching here?" he asked, wanting to keep the conversation away from himself. 3 years, Brielle said, sitting across from him. "I came out west after my father died. He always wanted to see the frontier, but never got the chance. I thought perhaps I could see it for him." "It's a hard place for a woman alone," Forrest observed. Brielle's smile held no illusion. "Yes, it is. But I've found purpose here. These children need education if they're to have any future beyond ranching and mining." Forrest took a sip of his coffee, surprised to find it was indeed decent, better than decent, in fact. "You make good coffee, Miss Winters." "Thank you. It's one of my few talents that doesn't involve parsing grammar or solving arithmetic." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant shouts and laughter of the children outside. Forrest found himself studying Brielle's face, the way the morning light caught in her hair, the small lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of smiles rather than hardship. "Your wife," Brielle said finally, her voice gentle. "Would you tell me about her?" The question caught Forrest off guard. Most people either avoided mentioning Beatrice or offered platitudes about her being in a better place. No one had simply asked about her. "Her name was Beatrice," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so many months of avoiding it. "Beatrice Tucker. She was everything. Kind, strong, stubborn as the day is long." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at the memory. "She could ride better than most men I knew, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even when it wasn't proper for a lady to do so." "She sounds remarkable," Brielle said. "She was," Forrest agreed, the tightness returning to his chest. "We were married for 6 years, trying to make a go of it on a small ranch in Colorado. Then last winter, she took sick. Influenza. I rode for the doctor, but the snow was too deep, the trails too dangerous. By the time I returned." He broke off, unable to continue. "I'm so sorry, Forrest," Brielle said, and the use of his first name felt like a warm hand on his heart. "I prayed," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "I prayed harder than I've ever prayed in my life. And it made no difference. She still died, alone, while I was out there trying to save her." Brielle reached across the desk, her hand coming to rest on his arm. Faith doesn't guarantee outcomes, Forrest. It gives us strength to face them. What kind of God lets good people die while the wicked prosper? The question had burned in him for months. I don't have an answer that would satisfy you, Brielle admitted. I only know that without faith, the world becomes a very dark place indeed. The bell outside rang, signaling the end of recess, and Brielle withdrew her hand. I should get back to my students, she said. But if you'd like to continue this conversation, I live in the small house just behind the school. You're welcome to join me for supper tonight. Forrest knew he should refuse. He should thank her for the coffee, mount his horse, and ride out of Redemption Creek without looking back. But something in her eyes, a mix of compassion and challenge, made him nod instead. I'd like that, he said, rising to his feet. What time should I arrive? 6 o'clock, Brielle said, a smile warming her face. And Mr. Tucker? Bring your appetite. I may not be the best cook in the territory, but I do try. As Forrest left the schoolhouse, he felt lighter somehow, as if some of the weight he'd been carrying had shifted slightly. It wasn't gone he doubted it ever would be, but for the first time in months, it felt bearable. The day passed slowly for Forrest. He spent it wandering the small town, observing the daily rhythm of life in Redemption Creek. He visited the general store for a new shirt, had his horse reshod at the blacksmith's, and avoided the saloon, wanting a clear head for his supper with Brielle. At precisely 6 o'clock, he knocked on the door of the small, neat house behind the schoolhouse. Brielle opened it, wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of it caught Forrest by surprise. He'd only seen her with her hair pinned up, and he found himself momentarily speechless. Right on time, she said, stepping aside to let him enter. I hope you like stew. It's one of the few dishes I can manage without disaster. The house was small but comfortable, with a table set for two, a small sitting area with bookshelves lining one wall, and a kitchen where a pot bubbled on the stove, filling the air with a savory aroma that made Forrest's stomach growl appreciatively. It smells wonderful, he said, removing his hat. He'd brought a bottle of wine, purchased from the general store at a price that had made him wince, but now he was glad for it. I brought this, he added, holding it out. How thoughtful, Brielle said, accepting the bottle with genuine pleasure. We'll have quite the feast tonight. The evening unfolded with an ease that Forrest hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. They ate Brielle's stew, which was indeed delicious, and drank the wine, talking of small things at first, and then of larger ones. Brielle told him of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of her father's work as a newspaper editor, of her decision to become a teacher and journey west after his death. In turn, Forrest found himself sharing stories of his own past, of growing up on a farm in Ohio, of joining the Union Army at 18, of meeting Beatrice at a town dance after the war and knowing, in that moment, that she was the woman he would marry. She laughed at me, Forrest recalled, a smile playing at his lips. I stepped on her toes during a waltz, and instead of being polite about it, she laughed right in my face and told me I danced like a newborn calf. Brielle's laughter joined the memory of Beatrice's, and the sound warmed Forrest in a way the wine could not. She sounds like she was a perfect match for you, Brielle said. She was, Forrest agreed, the familiar pain rising again, but somehow softened by the sharing of these memories. I never thought I'd find that kind of love again. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Brielle's eyes met his across the table, and in them, Forrest saw a reflection of his own loneliness, his own hope. Perhaps, Brielle said softly, there are different kinds of love in this world, each beautiful in its own way. The conversation shifted then to safer topics, but something had changed. A possibility had been acknowledged, a door left slightly ajar. When Forrest finally took his leave, the night air cool against his face, he knew with certainty that he would not be riding out of Redemption Creek the next day, or perhaps the day after that. For the first time since Beatrice's death, he had a reason to stay somewhere. As the days turned into weeks, Forrest found himself becoming a part of life in Redemption Creek. He took odd jobs around town, helping the blacksmith, mending fences for the widow Johnson, even assisting Sheriff Davis with tracking down a cattle rustler who'd been plaguing the local ranchers. But each day, he found his way to the schoolhouse, sometimes bringing Brielle wildflowers he'd picked on his morning rides, sometimes just sitting at the back of the classroom, watching her teach with a passion and dedication that stirred something in his heart he'd thought long dead. They spent their evenings together, sometimes at her house, sometimes walking along the creek for which the town was named. They talked of books they'd read, of places they'd seen, of dreams they'd held and lost. And slowly, without either of them quite realizing it was happening, a bond formed between them that went beyond friendship. One evening, as they sat on the bank of the creek, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Brielle asked the question Forrest had been dreading. "Will you ever be able to forgive him?" She asked quietly, her eyes on the water rushing past. Forrest didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I don't know," he admitted. "Every time I think about how she died, alone, afraid, I feel that anger rise up again." "Anger is a natural part of grief," Brielle said, "but it can consume you if you let it. Is that what you think is happening to me?" Brielle turned to face him, her expression serious. "I think you're carrying a burden that was never meant to be carried alone. Forrest, you've told me how Beatrice lived, but you've never told me how she died." "Not really." Forrest looked away, his jaw tightening. "I told you. Influenza. I went for the doctor, but by the time I returned, that's what happened." Brielle interrupted gently. "But not how she died. Not what it was like for you to find her." The memory rose up, sharp and painful as a knife. "She was in our bed," Forrest said, his voice barely audible above the sound of the creek. "She looked peaceful, like she was sleeping, but she was cold. So cold. I knew before I even touched her that she was gone." He drew a shuddering breath. "I should have been there. She shouldn't have died alone." "Do you think she blamed you?" Brielle asked. "No," Forrest admitted. "Beatrice never blamed anyone for anything. She believed everything happened for a reason, even the bad things. And you don't." "I used to. Now I'm not so sure." Brielle was quiet for a moment, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. "Faith isn't certainty, Forrest. It's hope in the face of doubt. It's believing that there's meaning, even when we can't see it." "Is that what you believe?" Forrest asked, looking at her profile against the darkening sky. "It's what gets me through each day," she said simply. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. Forrest looked down at their joined hands, at how right it felt to have Brielle's fingers intertwined with his. And with that rightness came a surge of guilt so strong it made him pull away abruptly. "I should go," he said, standing. "It's getting late." Brielle rose as well, confusion and hurt flickering across her face. "Forrest, what's wrong?" "Nothing," he said too quickly. I need to think." Without waiting for her response, he turned and strode away, leaving Brielle standing alone by the creek, her question unanswered. Forrest spent the night in his rented room, pacing the floor, his thoughts a turbulent mix of grief, guilt, and a new feeling he wasn't ready to name. How could he have feelings for Brielle when Beatrice had been gone for barely 7 months? What kind of man moved on so quickly? By morning, he'd made a decision. He would leave Redemption Creek. It was the only honorable thing to do. He packed his few belongings, settled his account with the saloon keeper, and headed to the livery to collect his horse. But as he walked through the town, past the general store where he'd bought supplies for Widow Johnson, past the blacksmiths where he'd spent hours working beside the burly man, past the schoolhouse where Brielle would be teaching her students, he felt a tug of belonging that he hadn't experienced in years. This town, these people, they had become important to him without his noticing. And Brielle had become essential. Instead of continuing to the livery, Forrest found himself turning toward the small cemetery behind the church. He made his way to the spot where he'd knelt that first night, where Brielle had found him and offered to pray beside him. This time, he didn't kneel. He stood, hat in hand, and spoke aloud. "B," he said, using the nickname he'd called her in their most private moments. "I don't know if you can hear me, or if there's anyone listening at all, but I need to say this." He took a deep breath. "I loved you with everything I had. I still do. But there's someone else now, someone who's helped me find my way back to living. And I feel like I'm betraying you by caring for her." The wind rustled through the grass, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its morning song. Forrest closed his eyes, imagining for a moment that it was Beatrice's voice he was hearing. "She asked me if you would blame me for not being there when you died," he continued. "And I know you wouldn't. You never blamed anyone for anything. But I blamed myself. and I blamed God. I've been carrying that blame for so long now that I don't know how to set it down. Perhaps you could start by sharing the weight. Forrest turned to find Brielle standing a few paces away, just as she had that first night. But this time, there were tears in her eyes. How long have you been standing there? He asked, his voice rough. Long enough, she said, stepping closer. Mr. Reynolds at the livery told me you'd asked for your horse to be saddled. I thought you were leaving without saying goodbye. I was going to, Forrest admitted. It seemed easier then. This. Then what, Forrest? Brielle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then admitting that I have feelings for you, he said, the words finally breaking free. Then admitting that when I'm with you, the pain eases. That I look forward to seeing you each day. That I think about you when we're apart. That I'm starting to imagine a future again, and you're in it. Brielle's eyes widened, and for a moment, Forrest feared he'd said too much, moved too quickly. But then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. There's room in there, she said softly, for both the love you had for Beatrice and whatever you might come to feel for me. Loving someone new doesn't diminish what you shared with her. It honors it, because it shows that she taught you how to love deeply and truly. Forrest's hand came up to cover hers. I don't know if I can offer you what you deserve, he said honestly. I'm still broken in so many ways. We're all broken, Forrest, Brielle said with a gentle smile. That's where the light gets in. He recognized the phrase from one of the poems she'd read to him on their walks, and the realization that she'd been paying attention to what moved him, what spoke to him, broke through the last of his resistance. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that was both an ending and a beginning. When they separated, Forrest rested his forehead against hers. I'm not leaving, he said, making the decision in that moment. Not today, not tomorrow. Good, Brielle said, her smile brightening her entire face. Because I've grown rather fond of having you around, Forrest Tucker. Even though I don't share your faith? It was the question that had been hanging between them, unasked until now. Faith isn't something you find once and keep forever, Brielle said thoughtfully. It's something you lose and find again, over and over throughout your life. I believe you'll find yours again, in your own time, in your own way. And until then. Her eyes met his, steady and sure. I'll pray beside you. As summer faded into autumn, and autumn gave way to winter, Forrest and Brielle's relationship deepened. He took a permanent job with the blacksmith, discovering a talent for ironwork that surprised him. She continued teaching, but now when school let out, she knew Forrest would be waiting to walk her home. The town watched their courtship with approving eyes. Redemption Creek had seen its share of hardship and heartbreak, and the sight of the grieving cowboy finding happiness with their beloved schoolteacher gave everyone a reason to smile. Forrest still visited the cemetery regularly, but now he went to tend Wyoming Winters' grave as well as to speak to Beatrice's memory. Sometimes Brielle accompanied him, sometimes he went alone, but always, he felt a sense of peace afterward that had been absent for so long. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside and a fire crackling in Brielle's small hearth, Forrest knelt before her with a ring he'd crafted himself in the blacksmith's forge. I know it's not fancy, he said, suddenly nervous as he held out the simple gold band. But it's made with love, just like everything I want to build with you. Brielle's eyes filled with tears as she extended her hand. It's perfect, she whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. Just like everything we've already built together. They were married in the spring, when the wildflowers that Forrest loved to bring Brielle were blooming across the plains. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the same church behind which Forrest had knelt in despair less than a year before. As they exchanged their vows, Forrest felt a peace settle over him that he recognized as the answer to the prayer Brielle had offered that night. His burden had been lightened, not by forgetting Beatrice, but by learning to carry her memory with grace instead of guilt. And when the minister asked them to bow their heads in prayer, Forrest did so without hesitation, his voice joining Brielle's in thanks for the journey that had brought them together. That night, as they lay in each other's arms in the small house that was now their home, Brielle traced the lines of Forrest's face with gentle fingers. Are you happy? She asked, her voice soft in the darkness. Forrest caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. I am, he said, and the truth of it filled him with wonder. "I didn't think I could be again, but I am. I'm glad," Brielle said, nestling closer to him. "Because I want a lifetime of happiness with you, Forrest Tucker." "A lifetime sounds just about right," Forrest agreed, pulling her closer. "Though I might need a bit longer to be sure." Brielle's laughter, warm and real, filled the room, and Forrest felt his heart expand with love for this woman who had taught him to live again, to hope again, to believe again. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek watched as the blacksmith and the schoolteacher built a life together. They welcomed 2 children, a boy with Forrest's quiet strength and Brielle's love of books, and a girl with Brielle's auburn hair and Forrest's skill with horses. They weathered hardships, celebrated joys, and through it all, they faced each day together. And each night, before they slept, Brielle would pray, her voice soft in the darkness, and Forrest would join her, his faith not a replacement for what he had lost, but something new and stronger for having been broken and mended. In the small cemetery behind the church, fresh flowers appeared regularly on Wyoming Winters' grave. And though Beatrice Tucker's body lay far away, her spirit lived on in the love Forrest had learned to give again, in the family he and Brielle created, and in the faith that had been lost and found, like a light rekindled in the darkest night. For in the end, it wasn't the stranger's prayer that had saved him, but the stranger herself, who had seen his brokenness and chosen to kneel beside him anyway. And in that simple act of compassion, Forrest Tucker had found not just love, but redemption.